The old factory stood like a sleeping monster at the edge of town. For 15 long years, no smoke had puffed from its tall chimneys, and no bright lights had shone from its dusty windows. Once, it had been a place of buzzing sounds, loud clangs, and happy workers, all powered by one enormous engine. This engine, a true giant of metal and gears, had hummed with life, making everything move. But now, it was a silent beast, a forgotten heart within the factory's chest. Cobwebs hung like ghostly curtains from the high ceilings, and thick dust covered every machine, every tool, every corner. The air inside was heavy and still, carrying the faint, old smell of oil and rust. Outside, weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and vines slowly crept up the brick walls, trying to claim the factory for nature. Children on bikes would sometimes dare each other to get close, their whispers full of wonder and a little fear about the silent place. They imagined what it must have been like when it was alive, when the ground would tremble softly from the engine's power. To many, the factory was just an old building, a reminder of times long past. But to others, it was a puzzle, a challenge. People said the engine was broken beyond repair, a tangled mess of metal that would never spin again. It just sat there, cold and unmoving, a monument to something lost. It was a giant that had given up, a silent testament to the passage of time. Even though the factory was quiet, its giant engine still held a strange pull. Important people, who owned the factory, couldn't just let such a big, powerful machine stay broken. So, they called for help. Not just any help, but the best help they could find. Smart engineers, known all over the world for fixing the toughest problems, came to the quiet factory. These engineers wore serious faces and carried fancy tools. They had bright lights and thick glasses. One by one, they would march into the engine room, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They would spend days, sometimes even weeks, poking and prodding the giant machine. They'd climb on it, peer into its dark insides, and whisper to each other in confusing words. They'd draw complicated diagrams and shake their heads. There was Professor Anya Sharma, famous for fixing tricky robots. There was Mr. Tanaka, who once started a train that had been stuck for years. And Dr. Ben Carter, whose books on engines were read in every school. Each one brought their best ideas and brightest minds. They tried everything they knew. They checked every wire, every gear, every pipe. They tested the fuel lines and looked at the spark plugs. They even brought special machines to listen to the engine, hoping to hear a tiny hint of life. But after all their hard work, their clever plans, and their endless tests, they all came to the same sad answer. They would gather in the dusty meeting room, their shoulders slumped. "It's impossible," they'd say, their voices tired. "The damage is too great. There's no way to bring it back. We've tried everything." Each time, their words were like another nail in the engine's coffin, confirming its fate as a silent giant. The owners would sigh, and the factory would go back to its lonely quiet, its engine still and cold. While the smart engineers came and went, shaking their heads, one person remained constant in the silent factory, Mr. Jones. He wasn't an engineer, he was the janitor. Even though the factory made nothing and no one worked there, Mr. Jones came every single day. He pushed his old cleaning cart with its squeaky wheels through the empty halls, a quiet swish of his broom echoing in the vast space. Mr. Jones was a kind man, with gentle eyes and a soft smile. He had worked at the factory since it first opened, back when the engine roared and the air vibrated with energy. He knew every loose floorboard, every creaky door, every secret passage. He knew which light switch was tricky and which window wouldn't quite close. He knew the factory better than anyone, even better than the people who owned it. He didn't just clean, he cared. He dusted the silent machines as if they were sleeping friends. He polished the railings until they gleamed, even though no one would touch them. He swept away the fallen leaves that snuck in through tiny gaps. He believed that even an empty place deserved to be looked after, to be treated with respect. The giant engine, which the engineers had given up on, was like an old friend to Mr. Jones. He would often stop by it, running a hand over its cold metal. He knew its shape, its bumps, its curves, and its hidden parts. He had watched it being built, seen it run perfectly for years, and now watched it sit still. He felt a quiet sadness for the engine, but also a deep knowledge of its every bolt and joint. He saw things the engineers, in their rush to find big problems, might have missed. He saw the factory not as a broken machine, but as a living memory, and he was its loyal keeper. Mr. Jones wasn't alone in his quiet care for the factory. Sometimes, after school, his daughter, Lily, would join him. Lily was a bright and curious girl, with eyes that sparkled with imagination. While other kids might have found the dusty, silent factory boring, Lily saw it as a magical kingdom waiting for a story. She loved to bring her worn-out sketchbook and a handful of colorful pencils. Her favorite spot was near the enormous, silent engine. To her, it wasn't just a broken machine. It was a sleeping giant, full of forgotten power and secret dreams. She would sit on a crate, her small legs swinging, and draw. She drew the huge gears that looked like sleeping flowers, the thick pipes that snaked like metal vines, and the countless bolts that dotted its surface like tiny stars. Lily didn't draw perfect, neat lines. Her drawings were full of energy, showing the engine as she imagined it, alive and roaring. She would add little swirls of smoke that weren't there, or bright flashes of light that only she could see in her mind. Her pictures were more than just copies of what she saw. They were her way of talking to the engine, imagining its past and dreaming of its future. Her dad would watch her sometimes, a gentle smile on his face. He understood that Lily saw things differently. She wasn't looking for what was broken. She was looking for what was beautiful, for the story within the metal. While the engineers saw only problems, Lily saw wonder. And as she drew, she slowly, without even knowing it, began to see the giant engine not as a collection of parts, but as a whole, waiting to be understood in a way no one else had tried. Lily's drawing wasn't just about making pretty pictures, it was about truly seeing. While the grown-up engineers looked for big, complicated problems, Lily's young eyes saw everything, big and small. She didn't have a plan or a checklist. She just looked. She looked at the way the light fell on a dusty pipe, the pattern of rust on a giant bolt, or how a tiny wire snaked around a corner. Her special way of seeing came from her love for drawing. To draw something well, you have to notice every little bit. You have to see the way a shadow falls, the exact shade of a color, or the tiny cracks in a surface. This made Lily notice things that most people, even very smart people, would walk right past. For example, she might notice a small, loose wire hanging slightly out of place, almost hidden behind a bigger pipe. It was so tiny, so unimportant looking, that the engineers, focused on huge systems and complex circuits, might have missed it entirely. Or she might spot a tiny speck of bright red rust in a spot where everything else was dark brown, a small clue that something was different there. She wasn't trying to fix the engine, she was just observing it, like a friendly detective. She'd sketch a gear and then pause, her brow furrowed, as she noticed a faint scratch that seemed to lead nowhere. She'd draw a lever and then wonder why it was angled just so. These weren't problems to her, just interesting parts of her subject. But in her quiet, careful looking, Lily was gathering pieces of a puzzle that no one else had bothered to put together. Her innocent curiosity was, in fact, a powerful tool, slowly uncovering the engine's secrets, one tiny detail at a time. One sunny afternoon, light streamed through a high window, cutting through the dusty air like a golden sword. Lily was sitting in her usual spot, sketchbook open, her pencil dancing across the paper. She was drawing a particularly tricky section of the engine, where pipes twisted around each other like giant metal snakes. Her focus was sharp, her eyes tracing every curve and shadow. As she worked, trying to get a tricky angle just right, her gaze followed a thick pipe down towards the floor. It was in a spot that was usually quite dark, hidden behind a large, forgotten control panel. But today, with the sunbeam cutting through, a tiny glint of metal caught her eye. It was small, no bigger than her thumb, and almost completely covered in years of grime and dust. It looked like a little handle, or perhaps a switch. It was so small, so out of the way, that it seemed to be a part of the engine that time had simply forgotten. The engineers, with their big lights and important plans, had likely never even seen it, their attention drawn to the larger, more obvious parts. They were looking for big problems, not tiny, almost invisible details. Lily, however, was not looking for problems. She was just looking. Her pencil paused. She leaned in closer, wiping away some of the dust with her finger. Underneath, She could just make out a small, worn symbol, a simple arrow pointing up and down. It was definitely a lever, hidden and still, patiently waiting. A spark of curiosity lit up in her mind. What was this tiny lever for? Why was it so carefully tucked away? It felt like finding a secret door in a very old, very big castle. Lily's eyes were wide with wonder as she stared at the tiny lever. She ran to find her dad, pulling on his sleeve. "Dad, look. What is this?" she asked, pointing to the forgotten switch. Mr. Jones, always patient, bent down to see where Lily was pointing. His eyes, so used to every inch of the factory, widened just a little. He had cleaned this area countless times, but even he had never truly noticed the small, dust-covered lever. It was so well hidden, almost part of the machinery's own shadows. He carefully brushed away more of the grime. "Well, I'll be," he mumbled, a flicker of surprise in his gentle eyes. "Looks like a safety switch, maybe, for something very old." He tried to move it, but it was stiff, stuck after so many years of not being touched. "Can we try to move it, Dad?" Lily asked, her voice a mix of excitement and quiet hope. Mr. Jones thought for a moment. What harm could it do? The engine was already impossible to fix. He fetched a small, clean rag and some oil from his cart. He carefully dabbed the oil around the lever, letting it soak in. Then, with Lily watching closely, holding her breath, he gently wiggled it. With a soft click that was surprisingly loud in the silent factory, the lever moved a tiny bit. Then, with a bit more effort, it slid all the way down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a sound, so faint it was almost a whisper, filled the air. It was a strange, quiet whirring sound, like a giant insect slowly waking up from a long sleep. It wasn't the roar of the engine, but it was a sound that hadn't been heard in that factory for 15 years. Lily's eyes sparkled, and a small smile touched Mr. Jones's lips. Something had just changed. The faint whirring sound grew a little louder, a soft hum that made the metal parts of the giant engine seem to shiver. Lily and Mr. Jones stood still, listening, hardly daring to breathe. It was a sound that had been lost for so long, a ghost of the factory's past. Then, the floor beneath their feet gave a tiny shudder. A deep, guttural rumble started, like a sleeping dragon stretching after a very long nap. It was slow at first, a heavy, almost tired sound. Dust, thick and old, puffed up from the engine's crevices, making hazy clouds in the sunbeams. The pipes and gears began to twitch, just a little, as if remembering how to move. Cough! The engine made a sound like a giant clearing its throat, a loud, grating noise that echoed through the vast space. Lily jumped, clutching her dad's hand, but her eyes were wide with excitement, not fear. Another cough, stronger this time, and then a slow, deliberate clunk as a huge gear turned a fraction of an inch. And then, with a mighty roar that shook the very foundations of the factory, the giant engine burst to life. Lights flickered on across the factory floor, dim at first, then brighter, chasing away the shadows of 15 years. The ground vibrated steadily, and the air filled with the powerful, rhythmic beat of the machine. Steam hissed from pipes, and the smell of oil, fresh and warm, replaced the old, dusty scent. Mr. Jones gasped, a look of pure shock and joy on his face. Lily cheered, jumping up and down. The engine, declared impossible by the smartest minds, was running. It was alive. The sound was deafening, thrilling, and completely unbelievable. It was a miracle, woken by a small girl and a forgotten lever. News travels fast, especially when it's about something impossible coming true. The factory owners, who had given up all hope, quickly brought back the smart engineers. They arrived with puzzled looks, expecting to find some mistake, perhaps a smaller, backup generator running. But when they stepped into the factory, the deep, powerful roar of the main engine left them speechless. Professor Sharma's jaw dropped. Mr. Tanaka's eyes grew wide behind his glasses. Dr. Carter, who had written books on engines, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. They walked around the now vibrating engine, touching its warm metal, checking their gauges. Everything showed it was the giant engine, running perfectly. But how? Professor Sharma finally managed to whisper, her voice full of disbelief. "We checked everything. Every circuit, every valve, every possible fault." Mr. Jones, with Lily shyly holding his hand, stepped forward. He calmly explained how Lily had found the tiny, forgotten lever, almost hidden from view. He showed them the spot, still slightly damp with oil. The engineers crowded around, bending low, their faces a mixture of wonder and a little embarrassment. They had spent weeks, months even, with complex tools and big ideas, missing something so small, yet so important. Lily, no longer just the janitor's daughter, but a quiet hero, became the center of attention. The engineers praised her sharp eyes and simple curiosity. They couldn't believe that a young girl, without any fancy training, had done what all their combined knowledge and experience had failed to do. It was a humbling lesson for them, a reminder that sometimes the biggest solutions come from the simplest observations, seen through fresh, unburdened eyes. Lily's simple discovery and her dad's helping hand didn't just restart an engine. It sparked a new way of thinking for everyone. The engineers, who had always relied on their deep knowledge and complex calculations, learned a valuable lesson that day. Sometimes, looking at a problem with a fresh mind, free from old ideas and expectations, can reveal the easiest answer. The factory owners decided to reopen the factory, giving jobs back to many people in town. And because of Lily, they started a new way of working. They encouraged everyone, from the newest worker to the oldest expert, to share their observations, no matter how small they seemed. They understood that every eye saw something a little different, and every different view could hold a key. Lily became a quiet legend in her town. She didn't become a famous engineer, but she kept drawing, always seeing the world with her special, careful eyes. Her story reminded everyone that wisdom isn't just found in big books or fancy degrees. It can also be found in curiosity, in patience, and in the simple act of truly looking at what's right in front of you. The giant engine, now humming with life, was a daily reminder that what seems impossible to some might just be waiting for the right pair of eyes and a little bit of wonder to bring it back to life. Lily, the janitor's daughter, taught them all that even the smallest person can make the biggest difference.